Hello and welcome to the second episode of Jason Statham Facebook. Um, we've officially been called Jason Statham Facebook
That's
like
us.
5 minutes ago.
That's
So
us.
that's us now. And if the real Jason Statham has an issue with that,
Could the real Jason Statham please stand up?
yeah, because we've got all these gnomes in the audience, so it would be appreciated if you stood up.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's quite hard to make you out from the gnomes.
yeah. Anyway, I'm Yuri, this is Archie,
Yep,
and
yep.
today's episode, as you may have guessed, is about gnomes, and specifically their continued quest for the gnome Hyperborea.
Gnomes are
Now,
real. Gnomes are
very much.
real.
Now some quick definitions. Hyperborea was some Greek bullshit.
It was
That
actually in
why
Romania.
it was actually in
They
Romania,
believed it was
but
north in the mountains and it was in Romania.
yeah, well,
Romania is the promised land.
the promised land of Greeks, yeah. But basically, it was like an ancient Greek thing as a concept, and that becomes relevant later, actually. But what gnomes are is actually like this mythical species. Doesn't have as close a connection to human DNA. It's kind of like when a question is really similar, and you and your friend have a really similar answer, but that's just because the question was similar
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
thing
yeah.
in like an exam. So it's
They
not plagiarism, it's just kind of a
Gnomes
different.
come from the Byzantine Empire is where they originated from.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You go. Sorry.
yeah, so the famous alchemist, that's the title. That's the problem with going this far back. The
Yeah,
famous
it gets a bit
alchemist,
muddy in the sort of writings.
yeah, the famous alchemist Stephen Nomus, uh
Know me to his
well,
friends.
yeah, Nomi. In fact,
Because all these
was
bitches
in
know me. Am I
Adrianople.
right? Yeah.
um, so was in Adrianople, just before it was conquered and became the Byzantine capital.
Yeah.
Uh, at some point, this is I should mention in the late stage of the Byzantine Empire. But basically, he through a complicated freak musical accident ended up creating gnomes, which is why gnomes actually have perfect pitch and are one of the few species that can sing castrata just naturally, whereas humans,
Mm.
as the name implies, you have to be like castrated or have a hormone
Yeah, yeah.
deficiency.
Much of it was destroyed during the siege of Constantinople, but we do have a nearly complete Vitruvian gnome. A very important resource when studying gnomes is this not quite complete, but yeah, half of a Vitruvian gnome. It displays gnome anatomy in great detail.
Yeah, it's like the left half.
Left half,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, the left half is it's we just have the left half of the Vitruvian
The
gnome,
Vitruvian gnome.
which yeah, the Vitruvian
Yeah.
gnome, which was kind of like this biologist joke before biology, I think, as a concept existed.
Yeah, biology
Uh,
wasn't. Biology's kind of recent.
yeah, biology was actually invented in 2005 by feminism to explain third genders, if you didn't know.
Yeah.
Uh, to progress society forward. And so what ended up happening was obviously in 1453,
Mhm.
as everyone
We all
knows,
know this
the
one. Come on,
Ottomans
guys.
enter Constantinople.
Yeah.
Ottomans enter Constantinople. Uh, and you would think, all right, well, all the gnomes had been kind of collectively pulled out of Adrianople before the siege,
Mm.
just due to them wanting to be in the Byzantine capital. But actually, during the Fourth Crusade, when the Republic of Venice sponsored crusaders to siege Constantinople, they took gnomes away. One of the stipulations in the contract that the Republic of
Yeah.
Venice made with the Crusaders was they would take these gnomes and they would actually send them back to Venice because gnomes are actually extremely valuable as slave
Yes.
labor.
Yeah. No.
And
Yeah.
because
They got tiny little
this was
hands.
the yeah, and because they're also like buff as hell, like naturally, like like gorillas, how they're really
Yeah, they're
buff.
kind of chunky, aren't they? You seen that picture of a
Yeah,
shaved monkey?
I have not,
Wait,
but
let me send that to you quickly.
very physiologically like close to gnomes because gnomes are kind of like buff. They're like small, but they're buff.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, and basically they get sent back to Venice, and the Doge of Venice actually pays the Crusaders in the currency of Venice at the time, which named after him was obviously Dogecoin.
Yeah.
Um, and and with the Dogecoin paid to the Crusaders, Venice actually kind of goes into debt. But the way Venice manages to stay afloat for the next like 300 years,
Gnome
until
labor. Yeah.
yeah, was just gnome labor. Yeah, because gnomes like you can have a crew of like 17 people on like a ship, and you gotta feed them, you gotta do all that stuff. Gnomes, they're a lot like camels as well.
Yeah.
Their like threshold for being thirsty is minimal. It's like their anatomy is like you got a stomach on the left, which we know from the Venturian gnome, and
Vitruvian
then
gnome.
on the right, the Dutch um the Dutch painter Rembrandt actually had a gnome servant and
Yeah. Yep.
was donated his body to the Dutch Academy of Sciences. And so when they cut him open, uh, they found that the bladder was actually as big as the stomach, and they were kind of put together. And because gnomes don't actually have a liver as a
No,
result
they
or
don't.
intestines, they can only eat gruel
Yeah.
and
Well, and
only drink
mushrooms.
water.
Mushrooms.
Mushrooms
And
too.
like little dust.
Uh,
Gnomes actually
yeah,
sort of migrated north and a bit west across Europe over the ages, because once the Ottoman Turks took over Constantinople, gnomes were seen as absolutely haram, and they were not allowed in, yeah,
yeah. I
the
mean,
Ottomans. So they
it
kind of got
was also
pushed
the fact
towards
that
Rembrandt and Scandinavia.
yeah, it was also the fact that at the time the Ottomans had had major issues with the Republic of Venice,
Yeah, and
and
goblins.
don't even get me started.
Another episode,
That's
maybe.
a story for another day. But with the Venetians, gnomes kind of became their big kind of thing that they liked and that they would use a lot. Again, you can feed them gruel, extremely cheap. They'll do anything. They're very hardworking. They've got that like, Lutheran like Protestant work ethic,
Yes. Yeah.
pretty much. And so when the Reformation happened, that becomes relevant. But before so, the
Well, I
gnomes,
assume you're referring to the religious Reformation, not the gnome Reformation.
no, those are two separate
Yeah,
events which
just wanted to make that
happen.
clear.
Yeah, we will get to this later, but at the moment we are simply talking about the Venetian phase of gnome
Yes, yeah,
history
the end of
that takes
the
place.
Byzantine gnomes and the start of the Venetian and Holy Roman gnomes. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much the Venetian period kind of lasts from the kind of beginning of the Fourth Crusade in like 1202,
Yep.
and when it basically means that is that in 1202 gnomes are now no longer solely controlled by Constantinople and
Yes.
Adrianople, the two cities.
Yep.
They're now also owned by Venice.
Uh-huh.
And what that meant was that through trade, people kind of found out about gnomes,
Yeah, once they
and
got into hands of merchants, they spread quite rapidly across a lot of Europe.
now Christianity adopted them fairly quickly, but
Mm.
Islam actually considered
Yeah.
gnome labor like immoral.
Well, they considered gnomes
So
in general haram. They weren't. You
yeah,
couldn't have a gnome near you. In
yeah,
a
because it
yeah.
was kind of a
It was haram.
man-made creature, and in Islamic theology, obviously there is only one God, so creating another creature is kind of playing God.
Well, yeah, the
Whereas
Quran talks heavily about gnomes. Actually, there's quite a lot of
yeah,
gnome and gnome coded
there's
subtext as well.
yeah, it's one of the things people like to bring up as to why the Quran is possibly the most accurate, apart from the fact that it has never been translated from original Arabic, is the chapters and chapters and chapters of like dog whistles about gnomes,
Yeah.
specifically like in Adrianople in 1157 there'll be a scientist who creates a species of smaller human-like creatures, sorry. uh it's one of the things that you kind of learn as someone who researches gnomes. But really the Venetian period ends in about 1330, and that is because of the um what's it called? The Portuguese Venetian trade conflict,
Yes. Yeah.
which happened due to Venice trying to expand out of the Mediterranean.
Uh-huh.
Due to one particular doge realizing that this kind of machine that the Venetians had built after the Ottoman Empire pretty much exterminated or like, kicked out most of the gnome population on
Yeah.
Venetian ships.
Mm-hmm.
And they tried to expand them, but the Portuguese, seeing the potential, actually started raiding the ships and kidnapping the gnomes.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, and this kind of just led to a lot of tension.
Gnome
The
tension. Yeah.
Yeah. What also happened was the actual gnomes, for about 3 centuries, they would grow this kind of enlightened kind of ideals of gnomism,
Yeah.
mainly through the kind of philosophy they read about, just generally feeling that they were being used. uh, it was very important for them that they kind of did stuff for themselves, which was kind of like this very gnome characteristic.
Yeah, a
That's
common saying among them was, "There's no place like Gnome," and that basically sort of is just about sticking together as fellow gnomes and just holding on, and that's a core gnome ideal. Is that?
It was actually the gnomic uprisings that we'll talk about later that inspired
Yeah,
the French Revolution.
yeah.
Uh,
The gnomish enlightenment came long before our what we would consider the enlightenment.
yeah, it's in a Eurocentric,
Yeah.
human-centric history. You tend to ignore a lot of the advancements that many other creatures made.
Yes.
Like the goblins being able to actually, like, they were able to circumnavigate the
Oh,
Cape
yeah. Long
uh,
long before we could. Yeah.
long before. And obviously, sea dragons creating submarines due to a sea dragon
Yeah.
disease actually being malformation of gills, making them dependent on air
Hmm.
rather than semi-dependent.
That was a real whoopsie,
Uh,
wasn't it, when they found that one out? They were like, "Whoops,
yeah, it
got that
was
wrong."
actually, yeah, it if you read the holy texts, it's like
Yeah,
this
and I
very
recommend
much
you
a
do read
curse.
their holy texts.
Yeah.
Yeah, like you can find them
Visit the
quite easily.
ruins too.
Yeah, oh for sure,
Yeah,
definitely. What
yeah, the
wonderful
the
place.
English translations aren't as good as the French translations just due to the um
Yeah,
you know
due to the
the
French.
yeah,
Yeah,
due to the French having more experience just because
I was.
it was confirmed.
Yeah, I was dragging my brother around those ruins. He wasn't too
Yeah.
interested in it, but they are really good.
Yeah, it's near St. Helena, I believe, is where they're all
Yes.
kind of constituted. Those were the origins of that culture.
Yeah.
Um but anyway, back to gnomes. I realized we
Yeah.
went a bit off
Sorry.
topic.
Sorry. Yeah. There's
So
just a lot of
gnomes
information to be gobbling up.
Gnomes arrive in Lisbon first. They arrive in Lisbon in 1330.
Yep.
And
Bang on.
this cuz at the time there was a lot of kind of trade between kind of the Aragons and the Portuguese.
Hmm.
Gnomes very quickly get noticed by trade delegations and instantly get taken. Now the Aragonese had known about gnomes, but they
Yeah.
never understood them or how to actually work with them.
Yeah.
But the thing is that a lot of the Portuguese had kind of traded with Venice so much that they learned a lot of secrets just by hearsay. So
Yes.
they were a bit less skilled than the Venetians at using them. But
Gnomes were
also,
still fairly, well understood at this point. Like
yeah,
there was a lot of mystery surrounding them, as there is today. But there was still a decent amount of sort of gnomish texts and stuff in circulation that people could look to, and there were even a few gnome. There were some gnomish steppe hordes that were still active gnome societies and stuff like that. So there were still
gnomish steppe
gnomish
hordes.
hordes, yeah,
Gnomish
gnomish
hordes were
horselands. Sorry.
Gnomish hordes were mainly as a result of kind of Byzantine trade with the Kievan Rus.
Yeah,
Uh, and because they did send gnomes there, but it was like minuscule, and they almost went extinct actually until the Mongol invasion. Um, and when the Mongol invasion happened, the Mongols kind of took. but they're a very different culture to the Western gnomes we're discussing.
Yeah,
Just due
no,
to
yeah,
them,
yeah.
they're very much just different, kind of very culturally different, very ideologically
Well, they
different.
didn't last that long, but I just think it's important to mention that there were some free gnome societies around at the time.
They were more just kind of integrated into Mongol society, just due
Yeah,
to
exactly
Mongolia
right.
not having as much prejudice towards gnomes. And also they integrated with Mongolians a lot, which is why the average height is actually lower, is because they tend to have gnomish genes.
Mm, mm,
Just
yeah,
as a result of them being so accepted.
yeah,
But anyway, uh, it spreads through Iberia, spreads to France, spreads to the north of the Holy Roman Empire,
yep.
spreads to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and that's about as far as it goes. It mostly spreads to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth just due to the fact that the King of France is at the time also the King of Poland,
Mm.
so they very much interlinked, very much
Yeah, a
trade a
lot of
lot.
gnome transit around that time,
Yeah,
to be honest.
the transporting really kind of became a thing with gnomes, just
Yeah,
because gnomes they're small.
they're little.
Importantly,
They
like
got
most, yeah, they're like two
yeah,
feet,
their hats
like 2 feet
actually
tall.
lock together, so you can get quite a lot of them in like a bunch. It's called a
Yeah,
gnome tail, and it's just lots of gnomes locked together by the hat and the beard.
yeah. The origin of the hat actually is to make it kind of eye level.
Yeah, yeah,
Just because before they would wear more flat style kind of round hats, and they would dress more in black to kind of conceal themselves, or more khaki, a kind of beigey color during the
mm,
summer. But later on they switched to red just to show where they were, because people kept like assaulting them practically just because they couldn't see them.
yeah, yeah,
And so what ends up happening is you flash forward like 300 years later,
hmm,
gnome kind of independence but is very much like a hot button issue. It has been brewing.
yeah, yeah,
Gnomish had always kind of been a language, but it was always, the attitude was always kind of like, okay, this is how things are, this is whatever. Pretty much the same attitude that was in France at the time, was absolutism was there, because whatever. And
yeah, yeah.
gnomes always kind of had this inherent feeling that they should be grateful that they exist. Obviously, just due to
Yeah.
their origins
Gnomes are
being,
just nice. They're just chill fellas, really.
yeah,
At
they
the end
are
of the day.
very, very like tolerant in
Yeah.
a lot of ways, and tolerance can be a virtue, but it also meant that they did take a lot of shit. And so the Protestant Reformation occurs,
Yep.
where a lot more simplified. And gnomes had always lived like very frugally, mostly due to not having much money, but also just due to them like only really needing like the red hat, and apart from that,
Yeah,
that's
just some
it.
like boots, red hat,
Yeah.
trousers, and a shirt, right? A few other belongings here
S-
and there. But they lived off the land quite a lot. They were mostly, yeah, they were sort of peasant communities, a lot of the gnomes.
Yeah, they lived in a lot of kind of communes, very primitive
Yeah,
communes,
gnomish communes.
gnomish communes, and it was just genuinely a thing of we should stick together. Unity is strength. A lot of
Mm.
kind of trade union messaging finds its roots in kind of
Yeah,
gnomish
gnomish culture.
virtues.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Gnomish had always kind of been skeptical of Catholicism, just due to their Byzantine origins, and obviously being
I
Byzantium
mean,
being kind of an
even
Orthodox.
quite recently in the sort of early modern time, a lot of them still followed the old gnome religions. The old gnome
Yeah,
gods that were still kind of quite popular among gnomish people.
the gnome gods were more as a result of the kind of this kind of when Adrianople fell, not all gnomes left. And gnomism is an Abrahamic religion, which I think is a thing
Yeah,
that
it's
people
important to
don't
mention.
really know.
Mm.
Is that the kind of four main Abrahamic religions? It's Judaism, which is just the Old Testament. Then
Hmm.
you have the New Testament on top of that, and Psalms with the Bible. And then you have the Quran. And then actually, the religion that takes all of that, that takes from all of it, is
Yeah, is gnome,
Gnomism.
and adds its
And
own,
the
the
interesting,
gnomish testaments on as well.
the Gnomish
Gnomish
testaments are very
texts.
much a
Yeah.
sectarian thing. The
Well,
main thing about actual Orthodox Gnomism is it has no direct holy text. It actually takes all of the texts as valid. It
yeah,
takes
that's true actually.
it.
Yeah.
It doesn't say which one's valid. It treats them all completely. And gnomism kind of evolved out of just being in a new environment and realizing that they kind of had to justify it. So they basically just said all of them were bad. And pretty much it was like a 60-40 split, with 60% being Catholic and 40% being like gnomish.
Yeah, gnomish of some variety. Yeah.
Yeah, there was a lot of different theories, mostly based like lingually and culturally. How Orthodox Christianity, there's like Bulgarian Orthodoxy, which is just
Exactly
you do the
right.
sums in Bulgarian.
Yeah.
And it was mostly just by language and like
Slight
different
bit of
dialects of Gnomish.
gnome divergence in gnomism and gnomish religions, but yeah, pretty consistent.
Yeah. But it isn't at all like other schisms where it's more hostile. It's just generally kind of leadership and stuff.
Yeah.
But anyway, in the 16th century, when the Protestant Reformation, gnomes actually sided with the Protestants by the majority.
Hmm.
Most of the ones that didn't were kind of more gnomish nobility. And gnomish nobility is not the same as regular nobility. Gnomish nobility meant that you were basically kind of under the patronage of a noble person.
Yeah.
So
Although some gnomes,
before
there are
you
a few
were, yeah.
notable gnomes like Radish Humpleskin, who did work his way up to be a petty duke in the Holy Roman Empire, and various other gnomes achieved similar feats.
Yeah, it was, but they never really. Most gnomes, most noble gnomes, never really got past a mayor, and even then, it was mostly of gnome communes.
Mm.
Uh, and what ended up happening is that a lot of them started, like I think it was like 89 percent, I believe is the official figure, and they
Yeah, I think that's
sided
right. That's
with
right.
a lot of those kind of people,
Let me just
and
check that 89%
that
for you. Sorry,
yes, oh, yeah.
88. But yeah, no, that's good.
88.
Yeah.
All right. But yeah. But point being, a large majority did side with them. And gnomish philosophy kind of booms after this.
Yeah.
Liechtenstein, which was always kind of a center of gnomish kind
Yeah.
of trading and moving, just due to it being between like Paris, the different capitals, Aachen, it was between Warsaw.
Yep.
It
Yep.
was, you could pretty much go anywhere from Liechtenstein.
Yeah, and there's a high gnomish
Um,
population there as well, so it kind of made sense.
to this day.
Yeah, to this day,
Uh,
it's one of the furthest
Liechtenstein,
south gnomish colonies today.
the Liechtenstein Gnomish commune
Yep.
actually declared Gnomism as its official religion and was the first to do so, followed closely by the Cadisan
Hmm.
and then by the Gibraltar
Yes,
one, like what we call Gibraltar now. I don't know exactly what it was. I think it was Gibraltar.
I think yeah.
And then Lisbon, and then finally Venice. Venice was more conservative just due to nomism being more accepted and them having being more accepted. To this day, northeastern Italy is very much a very conservative.
Yeah.
Uh, so you really do have to kind of analyze the different nuances and why that is. But after that, pretty much into the 19th century with industrialization, gnomes kind of lost their use because they were just too small to operate a
Exactly.
lot of the machinery.
Yeah. They moved on to
With
children instead.
nanotech, yeah,
Yeah.
just because children they were just a bit.
It's better, right?
But
You can tell them off more. You can't really tell off a gnome. They take it personally.
yeah, gnomes they're very much creatures of like, understanding and
Exactly.
discourse. And so what happened was is that the South also it became more there weren't as many forests. Of course, there was like the
Hmm.
Alps and stuff, but that had pretty much been populated to gnomish standards. Uh, And so a lot of the gnomes kind of migrated to, Kosovo and Albania and
Oh,
northern
and further
Greece.
north than that, into some gnomes still there today, more than even the south now. Gnomes settled in the Black Forests of Germany and even into Scandinavia.
Yeah, I mean, there was in Helsinki at a time, there was a large amount of gnomish migration to the point where gnomes actually have to be stood under armed guard due to the immense racism that actually occurred,
Hmm.
due to the fact that most of the people there thought they were going to be overtaken, but actually it was just known
Yeah, yeah, it
into
was.
Karelia,
Mm.
and they would move into Karelia. And actually, the basis on the founding of the Karelo-Finnic Republic in
Yeah, was
in the
gnome
Soviet
based.
Union was gnomes because gnomes made up a majority of it.
Yeah,
And the disillusion did come with concessions to gnomes.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, Now, one thing that a lot of people don't mention is the kind of gnomish migration into the Americas. Uh,
Yeah.
and
New
the
World
gnomish
gnomes, as they're
migration,
known.
New World gnomes pretty much were there from the start. Christopher Columbus, again, at the time this was regular. Christopher Columbus used gnomes when he
Oh.
went to
Yeah.
Hispaniola. Now, gnomes when they came to Hispaniola, some of them were left there, kind of discarded,
Yep.
and they kind of, they were fairly accepted by the Taino people. Gnomish and Taino are relatively
Surprisingly
kind of
similar, actually.
similar.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's again a lot of the cases with gnomes they tend to parallel
Yeah.
kind of cultural exchanges.
Mm.
And so what ended up happening is gnomes spread across the various places, and Andean gnomes are possibly some of the most traditional gnomes possible, just
Yeah.
kind of
They
as a
really flourished
rebuke.
in the New World. Gnomes did. They did really well for themselves.
Yeah. And Andean gnomes specifically, they came with conquistadors, and Spanish gnomes were particularly like attempted to be Spanishized, like Spanified. I don't know, but they attempted to be converted into Spanish,
Yeah.
kind of culturally.
Hmm.
So they kind of doubled down on their fervor for gnomism, gnomist kind of traditions,
Yep.
and of course the search for Hyperborea.
Always.
And so when they got to the Andes and they saw like mountains and rivers and it was cold, because Hyperborea was meant to be Romania, and because of when they were made in the wintertime, they saw it as being cold. They thought they had found Hyperborea, and that's where you find probably the most radical sect of Gnomism. Uh, they believe they have found Hyperborea, and they use the lithium reserves that they mine there
Yeah.
as a way of maintaining Hyperborea.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
Definitely.
there are issues with because it is a theocracy, which is kind of antithetical to
Yeah. It's
gnomism,
a little
like
bit of sort of
monomus.
gnomish unrest in that society, but yeah, it's a very very
It's
top down, which isn't a very. It's not like a classic gnomish commune that you'd normally see.
it's very much the largest gnomish cathedral is actually built there after the destruction of the gnomish temple in Liechtenstein,
Yeah.
which occurred during the Napoleonic Wars. But luckily, that was partially saved, and it remains not fully constructed. They've built kind of under it, built around it,
Mm.
but it remains not fully constructed to remember the prejudice felt under the Napoleonic regime by gnomes.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that still
Uh,
remains today as well. It's why many gnomes have moved into sort of hiding in forests and stuff, but they are still real. They just
yeah, they
are less
are.
seen now and less accepted.
It's always been a fairly insular community,
Yeah, yeah,
just due to the fact that they are fundamentally different to human beings, which it's a very important issue. I feel like to bring attention to them because you don't see one every day, but
no,
they
no,
do
you
still
don't.
exist.
Yeah, it's quite, especially for those who live in urban areas. It's probably quite unlikely that maybe you've never even seen a gnome. I kind of doubt that, but it's yeah, a lot harder to see them in the modern day.
I
Uh,
mean, there are only 100 in the UK.
yeah, yeah.
Um, there are 200 in France, and the majority of them are in like the deepest Andean mountains.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, this has pretty much been a very rough guide to gnome
Yeah,
history and gnome culture.
possibly we'll come back and talk about sort of some of the gnome wars, gnomes in the modern day. There's loads to discuss on gnomes. They're very very
It's
interesting.
it's it's very fascinating
Yeah,
and very interesting how they did.
it is.
But
Yeah,
thank you for listening. I hope you
yeah,
enjoyed,
yeah.
and we'll see you next
Thank you
time.
for making it this far. If you did,
Yeah. Shout out to you.
yeah, shout out to you, whoever you are. But yeah, yeah, that's the end of the podcast. Shout out to gnomes.
Keep on gnoming.
Keep on gnoming,
Is
everyone. Goodbye.
yeah.